We now come to the seventh of our lectures in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, and Luke is going to describe all of the things that happened at the climax of his ministry. It is in this part of the Gospels that it is increasingly clear that the Gospel writers are not attempting to write a biography of Jesus, at least not in the modern sense of the word. Only Matthew and Luke have told us anything at all about his birth and the incidents surrounding his infancy. And Luke alone actually tells us about the trip to Jerusalem when he was 12 years old. But the 18 years in Nazareth, between when he was 12 years old and when he began his public ministry, those are silent. The Gospels say nothing at all about that. So the Gospels are, in fact, a unique genre of literature that are focusing upon Jesus as the Christ, as the Messiah. This is not simply a biography. This is an emphasis upon Jesus' unique role as the Son of God and as the Christ. And as we continue through the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem, we will find that the Gospels are going to focus most clearly upon that last week of his life, the week in which he was in Jerusalem that climaxed with his execution and crucifixion on the cross. So it is to these events that we now turn. The travelogue in Luke is now complete. We've spent roughly the last 10 chapters with Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. And now Luke is going to bring this gospel to a climax by describing what later is going to be one of the men on the road to Emmaus is the things that happened in Jerusalem. And so now we are going to look at those things. And in summary, we will be looking at the triumphant entry of Jesus in Jerusalem, which sets the stage for this last week. We will be talking about his cleansing of the temple. And at this point, the Jewish leadership is firmly going to turn against him. We're going to talk about his teachings in the temple courtyard. Various groups are going to interview him, critique him, criticize him. And we'll look at that and some of his responses. And then, especially, we will look at Jesus' teaching to the disciples about the fall of the temple, which would be his last major discourse in the Gospel of Luke. So let's begin with the triumphant entry. This is what Christians call it, the triumphant entry. Although as you read the incident in Luke's Gospel, the word triumphant sounds like it might be just, we're not sure if this is the right word because it ends with Jesus weeping over the city. At least it isn't the triumph of a conquering hero, something like that. But in the last villages on the Jericho road, prior to reaching Jerusalem, Jesus is going to send a couple of the disciples to find a colt upon which to ride into the city. Now, the use of a colt or a donkey is really an important idea because this is a domestic animal. This means that Jesus is coming into the city in peace. This is quite different than Jesus riding on a horse. Horses are used for war. Donkeys are used for domestic purposes. As Jesus comes riding into the city, there is a place where the road breaks over the edge of the hill and the city of Jerusalem kind of comes into view. And the pilgrims accompanying Jesus, as they see the city break into view, they begin to chant from Psalm 118, which is what is part of what is called the Egyptian Hallel, or the Egyptian praise psalms. These are psalms that glorify God for deliverance from Egypt. And within Psalm 118, there is this passage that says, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And so the pilgrims are chanting this. The Pharisees, for their part, are very angry because, not because the psalm was chanted, this was the traditional psalm that pilgrims did chant when they came to Jerusalem for Passover. So it wasn't that they were chanting this psalm, but that they were chanting it in honor of Jesus, who's riding on the donkey and coming in as the Messianic king. So they are very furious about this. And in short, in a very little time, they will get together with the Sadducees and the whole Sanhedrin, and they will try to find a way to arrest Jesus. Jesus, for his part, however, looks at the city and begins to weep. He knows that in just a few decades, this city will face its worst moment in history. Titus Vespasian and the Roman army will have surrounded the city. They will break down the wall. They will crucify hundreds and hundreds of Jews. You can read more details about this in the works of Flavius Josephus. But Jesus began to weep over this city and the disastrous future that awaited the city just about 40 years into the future. This is the side of the city, the eastern gate side of the city, through which Jesus entered in Jerusalem. Now, these are not the gates that Jesus entered into. These gates have been walled up for several hundred years already, but they are still not the original gates. These gates only go back to the Byzantine period. But a few decades ago, archaeologists discovered beneath these gates the foundations of the older gate that would have been there in the first century. And so even though this is not the gate through which Jesus passed, this certainly is the area through which Jesus passed. It's not really conducive to do excavation in this area. This is right next to a cemetery, and of course, any kind of excavation near the Temple Mount is, well, it's dicey to say the least because of the different authorities that attempt to control the Temple Mount, particularly the Muslims who control the Temple Mount with the Dome of the Rock and have for many hundreds of years. All four of the Gospels are going to describe Jesus as cleansing the temple. Now, John's Gospel is going to put it near the beginning of his Gospel, while the Synoptics are going to put the cleansing of the temple in Jesus' last week in Jerusalem. Either Jesus cleansed the temple twice, which doesn't sound all that likely, or else John has just relocated the story of the cleansing of the temple and is not attempting to be chronological. But in any case, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe Jesus cleansing the temple near the beginning of his last week in Jerusalem. In doing this, Jesus is going to drive out the money exchangers and the merchants who are selling sacrificial animals. The money exchangers are going to change coinage into Tyrian shekels, which is the only accepted money for offerings in the temple. And of course, the merchants are going to sell sacrificial animals, lambs, a variety of kinds of animals, making sure that they are clean animals, that they don't have blemishes and that sort of thing. But they're doing this in the court of the nations. Now, the court of the nations is the only place where non-Jews could come to pray, which is why it's called the court of the nations. And instead of reserving this as a place for prayer for outsiders to the Jewish community, they have turned it into a market. And Jesus is going to quote from Jeremiah's temple sermon. Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, has two chapters that deal with Jeremiah's temple sermon. One is chapter 7, the other is chapter 26. And in this temple sermon, Jeremiah, several hundred years earlier, would stand at the gate of the temple and speak to the people coming to worship and say to them, you must change your ways. You must change your direction if you want this temple to survive. You can't simply say, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh, as though just having this temple here was some sort of political guarantee of your future. If you really change your ways, then God says, I will let you live in this place. But if you do not change your ways, this temple is going to become like the ancient tabernacle that was destroyed all the way back in the days of Eli when the ark of God was taken captive. So in quoting from Jeremiah's temple sermon, Jesus is in a sense reliving the ministry of Jeremiah, other than that this would be for the second temple, not the first temple. And Jesus' words against the temple and driving out the money exchangers and merchants seem to be sort of the last straw for the authorities of the temple, and they begin now to seek for an occasion to bring Jesus to death. This is Roman coinage. This is the head of Tiberius Caesar, which was the Caesar in control during the time of John the Baptist's ministry and Jesus' ministry. We talked about that in one of the very early lectures. But the temple would not accept this coinage for temple offerings, because the head of Caesar, and the obverse of the coin also, it seems to indicate that Caesar is divine. And so this would be for them a violation of the first commandment and the second commandment. So if you were coming to the temple and you were going to offer offerings to the temple, if you're going to use money to purchase sacrificial animals at the temple, you had to use the Tyrian shekel. And so these Roman coins had to be exchanged for temple coinage to avoid sacrilege. This is the Temple Mount. We know that Jesus came in the eastern side, so that would be, if you can follow my cursor, this would be on this side. This is where the eastern gate is toward the Temple Mount, and these are basically cemeteries that are on the slope facing down into the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley is this valley on the east side of the city. These huge retaining walls that you see here along the south side and that extend up to the north side and then across here and then down to this side. These are the huge retaining walls that were built by Herod the Great. He began building this even before the time of Jesus. And these huge ashlars used to build the Temple Mount and to extend it into this large flat area are the largest quarried stones in antiquity. Considerably larger, actually, than the stones in the pyramid. Now, today, of course, right here in the middle area of the Temple Mount is the Al-Aqsa, which is the Muslim dome of the rock. And it has been there for several hundred years. But the temple of that Jesus would have entered into, this what we call the second temple, would have been approximately in this same area. Now, archaeologists debate exactly where the temple was located on this mountaintop. There are a number of opinions, but at least it was somewhere in this general area. If you go to the south of the temple, you find here a little set of steps which are from the first century, and these are likely the place where Jesus, as a boy of 12, stood and answered questions and asked questions to the rabbis when his parents brought him to Jerusalem. And then if you follow around on this side of the Temple Mount, you find an open plaza here, which is facing what is called the Western Wall, or the popular term for it is the Wailing Wall. This is where Jews were allowed to come to pray, even when they could not go up to the Temple Mount. And then down on the southeast corner, there was originally a huge stairway, an entry gate into this area of Jerusalem, in the area of the temple. So this is the Temple Mount as we see it today, but it is still reinforced by the huge retaining walls that were built 2 millennia ago. Now, Jesus stayed in public in the temple each day. So this is an open area. This is a public area. He's teaching the people. He's answering questions from some of his critics who are doing their best to trap him. Some of those questions he deflects with other questions, like the question about authority, where they ask him, where's your authority to do all these things? And instead of answering their question, he says, well, let me ask you a question. The baptism of John, was it of heaven? Or is it just merely human? Well, that's a double-edged question. They didn't want to answer it, because if they said John's ministry was from heaven, John is the one who predicted the coming of Jesus. And on the other hand, if they said John's ministry was simply human, everybody considered John to be a prophet. And in fact, they were afraid they might even get stoned if they would say something like that. So they didn't say anything. And some he addresses in parables. He speaks, for instance, of the parable of the vineyard tenant farmers. And this goes back to the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah chapter 5, where God depicts Israel in the metaphor of a vineyard. And he came repeatedly to find fruit from this vineyard, but he could find no fruit. And because of that, he determined that he would destroy the vineyard. Now, in a similar parable, Jesus is talking about a vineyard, and the owner is going to send several of his servants to see if there is fruit in the vineyard. And when they do not find it, the tenant farmers are going to abuse and in some cases kill these servants. Finally, the owner sends his own son, and they will kill his son. And this is certainly a prelude to the rejection of Jesus and the fact that the Jewish leadership are going to try to execute him. And sometimes he hands out different kinds of responses, such as the question about paying taxes to Caesar. We will look at that a little closer in just a moment. And sometimes he cites passages from the Torah, such as when he interacts with the Sadducees about questions in the afterlife and marriage. Here's the question about the imperial poll tax. This is something that everybody had to contribute to the Roman Empire every year. So they came and asked him whether they should pay taxes to Caesar or not. Now, this is a tricky question, and it was intended to be a tricky question. They're trying to put Jesus in as difficult a situation as possible. If Jesus says you should pay the tax, of course, he's going to lose popular support because no one loved to pay this tax. This is an added taxation of the Roman Empire that everybody resented deeply. On the other hand, if Jesus says you don't have to pay taxes to Caesar, his critics are going to report him as a resistor to the Roman Empire and the Roman government. So this was a lose-lose situation. No matter what Jesus said, they were going to put him in a bad light. But Jesus says, show me a coin. And they show him a coin just like this one, with the head of Tiberius Caesar in it. And Jesus asks the question, whose image is on the coin? Well, everybody knows it's the image of Caesar. And then Jesus says this interesting statement. He says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God. Now, the point of this is that if the image of Caesar is in the coin, where is the image of God? And going back all the way to the very creation itself, the image of God is in the human person. God created man in his own image. And by saying, give to God what is God's, Jesus is basically saying, you need to give yourself to God because the image of God is in you. You should give that to God, your very own self. Finally, Jesus is going to himself take the initiative. They've been grilling him, question after question, trying to trap him. And so Jesus finally takes the initiative and he says, I will also ask you a question. And his question comes from Psalm 110, the first verse. This psalm begins with a statement, Yahweh said to my Lord, sit on my right hand until I make all of your enemies a footstool for your feet. Well, all of the theologians in Judaism agreed on a couple of things. First of all, they agreed that the Messiah would be the son of David. In fact, this is what the prophets say again and again. This is a repeating theme in the prophets, and a number of prophets say this very clearly. Also, they would see the phrase, my Lord, which is the term Adonai in Hebrew, they would see that as referring to the Messiah. So if Adonai is the Messiah and Yahweh says to Adonai, sit on my right hand, this would be Yahweh's declaration to the Messiah, then how in this psalm is this related to David? Because David is writing this and he is not just going to say, the Lord, he's going to say, my Lord. So if Adonai is David's Lord, how could he at the same time be David's son? It was generally agreed among the Jews that the ancestors are always the more prominent than the descendants. And yet, if David is speaking of Adonai as my Lord, and Yahweh says to my Lord, how can Adonai at the same time be David's son? The implication, of course, is that the son of David is also a divine figure. And the implications are profound. No one could have been greater than David except a divine figure. David was the king of Israel. But if Adonai was greater than David, he must have been divine. And then how could he be his son? And from that time on, they quit asking him questions. They had no idea what to say about this and probably had never even thought about this passage in this way before. Now Jesus is going to give a discourse about the temple. And as I mentioned earlier, Jeremiah's temple sermon against the temple back in the 7th century BC is sort of the launching point for this. Jesus quotes Jeremiah when he is in the temple, driving out the money changers, and now he is going to give a lengthy discourse on the future of the temple. Just like Jeremiah, Jesus is going to predict that the temple will be destroyed. This temple will be destroyed, the second temple. And of course, historically, we know that that actually happened in AD 70 from the Romans. And in this discourse, Jesus is going to describe the temple using what we might call apocalyptic language. This is apocalyptic language is highly symbolic language. Between the Testament, there is quite a range of literature called apocalyptic literature or Jewish apocalyptic. Quite a number of apocalypses were written. And eventually we will have one book in the New Testament that's written in that style, which is the Revelation of John. And the first line in it speaks of it as the Apocalypse of John. In apocalyptic literature, there is frequently a discussion about the end of the age and about the end of political systems, and in some cases about the coming of a great champion. Jesus is going to use some of this kind of language in describing the fall of the temple. Now, all three synoptic gospels contain this discourse, but they handle it slightly differently. They each emphasize a little bit different aspect of the words of Jesus. Luke is going to put the emphasis on the temple itself. Mark and Matthew are going to emphasize more what is called the coming of the Son of Man. Now, Luke is going to use that phrase too, the coming of the Son of Man. But Luke's emphasis is really very much on the destruction of the temple. In fact, if you look very closely in chapter 21 at what Luke says, beginning in verse 5, the disciples are telling Jesus, look at these stones and all the things connected with the temple, which are quite impressive. But Jesus says, there's not going to be one stone left in another. He says, many are going to come in my name, and they're going to say, I am the one. But when you hear of that, don't be fooled. And then down in verse 20, notice especially, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart. And let not those who are out in the country enter it, for these are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Finally, in verse 24, he says that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And many will be killed by the sword, and many will be taken captive. Now, everybody agrees that Jesus is talking about what will happen in the 40 years. This is what will happen in the destruction of the temple. However, the larger focus of this discourse, there is a fair amount of theological discussion about it. First of all, let's take a quick look at the temple itself. This is a model of the temple. You can see by the people standing in the background just how large this model is. It's a model not only of the Jerusalem temple, but of first century Jerusalem. So it has not only the temple, but also the city. It has the Antonia Fortress, which is the Roman fortress on the northern side of the Temple Mount. It even has the Hippodrome that was built for chariot racing in the city, all those sorts of things. Visitors who take a trip to the Holy Land, a pilgrimage or a tour, will often go to this model, which is in the hotel district, just to kind of get a feel for what first century Jerusalem must have looked like. This is the southeast corner of the Temple Mount that I showed you a larger picture of earlier. And this little projection here, which is called Robinson's Arch, is all that is left of what at one time was a large stairway into the temple. And then above this arch would have been an entryway into the Temple Mount. If you look carefully at these stones, these lower courses, which are more horizontal, are the courses that were laid by Herod the Great. And so these stones are very old. They're 2 millennia old, and they've been there all of this time. As you get up, you see the courses of stone change to different types of stone. This moves you up through the Byzantine period, the Muslim period, and so the upper stones of the Temple Mount, in fact, are much later than the time of Herod. It's just these basic stones down here where you can see the seam changes here, and then around the corner it changes here. These are the stones that were laid by Herod. Many of the stones on the top were tumbled down by the Romans, and in fact, down here at the bottom, archaeologists have still left a number of these tumbled stones, which are remnants of what happened in AD 70. Now, back to the discourse about the temple, this last discourse of Jesus. Jesus is going to talk about the destruction of the temple, but he's also going to mention the coming of the Son of Man. And there is a fair amount of interpretive debate over just what Jesus means by this. Does Jesus refer here to his second advent? Already in his previous teaching, he has talked about the difference between his first and his second advent. Or does Jesus refer to his coming in judgment on the temple itself in AD 70? So that's a debated issue, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Then there is this phrase that he uses in verse 32, the fulfillment of all things. What does that mean? Does that mean the fulfillment of the end of the age? Or does that mean the fulfillment of the prediction about the temple's fall? So what does that refer to? Now, there's no disagreement that Jesus predicted the end of the second temple. That is in clear language that everybody is on the same page there. But there is considerable disagreement about the meaning of the coming of the Son of Man and the fulfillment of all things. What I'm going to show you next are the 3 major ways of reading this passage. And you will find Christians, very deeply devoted Christians, who are in support of each of these 3 positions. The first one comes from the theology of dispensationalism. This is a theology that began in the early 1800s in England, largely the thought of a man by the name of John Darby. But John Darby's ideas eventually spread from England to America in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And they were captured in a very popular annotated Bible called the Scofield Reference Bible. So many conservative Christians in America, particularly Christians within probably the larger areas would be the Baptist denominations and the Pentecostal denominations, they have become adherents to dispensational thought. And in this idea, the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is certainly part of Luke's discourse, but they also urge that there will be a third temple to be built. And the desecration that Jesus talks about really relates to a third temple. The coming of Jesus, then, is the coming of Jesus at the end of the age. This is an event that is still ahead of us within this dispensational way of thinking. And finally, the fulfillment of all things is the end of history, or the end of the present era as we know it. So this is one particular position, and you will find many devoted Christians who will follow this. But then there is kind of at the opposite extreme, what is called the preterist position. The word preterist basically means something that has already happened. Here, the destruction of the temple that Jesus describes in Luke 21 is all about what would happen in AD 70. And so they read the entire discourse as referring to something that is not in the future, but something that is in the past. So the coming of Jesus is the coming of Jesus in judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70. So they are not reading the phrase, the coming of the Son of Man, as referring to the end of the age, but as something that will refer to an event just about 4 decades ahead. And a very critical point for them is that Jesus said this generation would not pass. until this is fulfilled. So the fulfillment of all things is, in fact, the end of the second temple. And the generation that would not pass would be the actual people who were listening to Jesus speak as he was speaking. Then there is a mediating position, which sees that, in fact, there is kind of an intermingling of the near event with the far event, so that the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is certainly in view in Luke's discourse, but the end of the age is also in view, and these kind of overlap each other. So the destruction of the second temple and the second advent of Christ, or the coming of the Son of Man, are both within the scope of this single prophecy, and they probably cannot be easily unraveled because these two events kind of play off of each other. So in this viewpoint, then, the near event becomes a double meaning, or a double entendre, if you will, for the far event. And both of them are concerned, both ideas are intertwined within the discourse. I'm not going to try to sort this out for you. You will find that different Christian groups will take different positions. But at least you should be aware of the three positions that are here. Personally, I favor the mediating position, which is the third of these, but I will confess I hold this rather loosely. I don't think this is a major point of Christian theology. It's something Christians can discuss, and so long as they discuss it with some generosity and respect for each other, I think that would be fine. One thing is clear. There's going to be two paths into the future, and you can't have it both ways. Eventually, the Jewish people are going to be without a temple, without land, or without Jewish sovereignty. But they're not going to realize this until AD 70. The followers of Jesus, on the other hand, are going to already begin rethinking the idea of temple, because Jesus says to them clearly the temple will be destroyed. Not one stone will be left on another. And so Christians have already begun thinking about the idea that if this temple is destroyed, then there must be some other way of thinking about temple. This is going to become much more explicit when you get to the letters of the New Testament, particularly the letters of St. Paul, where Paul is going to say that the body of Christians has become the temple of the Holy Spirit. So no longer do we associate the most holy place as the dwelling place of God, but rather the church becomes the dwelling place of God. And worship and good deeds become the daily sacrifice. We are no longer then to offer blood sacrifices at the temple, but rather we offer the sacrifice of praise, the fruit of our lips. And we have entered into a new kind of worship, as Jesus himself would indicate in the Gospel of John. The day is coming and now is when the true worshipers of the Father will worship him in spirit and in truth. And every believer is a priest before God, able to come before God directly. The veil in the temple has been torn in two, signifying that everyone now has access directly to God in the most holy place. And as is the theme of the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, atonement for sin has been completed once and for all. The great day of atonement has happened in the death of Jesus on the cross. So this is the Christian pathway into the future. Judaism, of course, is going to have to find another pathway, but they won't have to embark on that until the temple is destroyed. But in fact, it would be destroyed, and when that happens, then the synagogue will succeed the temple. There will not be a temple anymore. Daily prayer is going to be replaced by replace the daily sacrifice. The rabbis are going to inherit the authority of the priest because there will be no temple. There will no longer be a need for a priesthood. And finally, the altar of atonement is replaced by the family table. So Judaism also is going to have to reinterpret the theology of the temple, but they're going to do it in a different way than Christians. And this approach in Judaism is what still holds the day for Jews even in the modern world. Now, we need to then talk about the rejection and the death of Jesus. We will not finish this part in this lecture. We will not get to the actual death of Jesus until the last lecture, but we do want to start the narratives that talk about Jesus' rejection. These events that lead to his passion. The final events are going to begin around the Festival of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day festival beginning with the Passover on the first of those 7 days. And at that time, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 apostles, is prompted by Satan to make arrangements to betray Jesus. Now, there have been a variety of attempts to sort of reclaim Judas, if not make him out a hero, at least take some of the sting out of his betrayal. The most recent of those, I suppose, would be the publication of the Gospel of Judas by the National Geographic Society, which attempts to exonerate Judas. But Luke doesn't follow that idea at all. He makes it very clear that Satan entered into Judas to betray Jesus. So on the evening of the Passover, Peter and John are going to prepare an upper room for this final meal of Jesus with the disciples. All 4 of the Gospels describe this last meal, but they don't all describe it in quite the same way. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are going to show the disciples preparing the room. They are going to have the narrative of the Eucharist, where Jesus takes the bread, gives thanks, breaks it, gives it to them. He takes the cup, gives thanks, shares it with them, and the teaching on servanthood. John, however, has some extra parts. It has the narrative about the washing of feet, which is only in John. Also the teaching on the new commandment of love, and finally the teaching on the Holy Spirit, or the parakletos, which is the Greek word for comforter, or paraclete, as we transliterate it. Then all 4 of the Gospels are going to talk about the meal itself. All 4 of them are going to talk about Jesus' prediction that Peter would deny the Lord, and all of them are going to have the disciples leaving the upper room and going to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus will be arrested. Incidentally, this is the traditional site of the Last Supper. The upper structure here that you see in this photograph is not nearly as old as the time of Jesus. This goes back to the period of the Crusaders about 1,000 years ago. But beneath this, down in the lower part, there are foundations of a site that goes back, in fact, to about the 1st century. And this structure is going to be called the cenacle, which is a word that comes from the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome. This is the site that has the oldest tradition for being the place where Jesus held the Last Supper with the disciples. So we don't absolutely know that that's true, but it is a very old tradition that goes back at least as far back as the 3rd century. Now, we need to say something about the Passover meal itself and how it was held. There were 4 stages. The first stage begins with the blessing of the first cup of wine, and then the explanation of the preliminary dish, and the placing of the meal, and the mixing of the second cup of wine. People attending a Passover traditional meal, of course, are going to be reclining. That is, they're not seated in chairs at a table. They're not going to be placed like Leonardo da Vinci placed them in his famous painting of the Last Supper. Rather, they're going to be lying on their side, propped up on one elbow, and then using their right hand to reach out to a very low table, or perhaps even a carpet on the floor, where the meal is actually being served. In the second stage, the traditional Passover story is going to be recited. The story of how the Israelites came out of Egypt in the Passover. And they will begin singing the great Hallel, the Passover Psalms that we mentioned earlier. And they will drink the second cup of wine. The third stage is the one that probably is the most significant for Christians, because this will include the blessing of the unleavened bread, the actual meal, which would be a meal of a lamb, and then the blessing and drinking of the third cup of wine. This is most likely the part of the meal that Jesus used to institute what we call the Eucharist, or the communion. The term Eucharist is taken actually from the Greek verb of this passage, which is Eucharisteo, where Jesus takes the bread and he gives thanks. and he takes the cup and he gives thanks. This Greek word verb, eucharistao, then is kind of formed into a noun for Christian called the Eucharist or the Thanksgiving. It's also called the communion, though, or the koinonia, later in the letters of St. Paul. Then after this stage, there is the fourth stage where they will sing the other psalms in the great Hallel. They will drink the fourth cup of wine. There will be a final blessing, final hymn, and then they will end the meal. Now, in this third stage, Jesus seems to clearly link the meaning of his death with the new covenant that Jeremiah talks about back in Jeremiah chapter 31. And because Jesus talks about his coming suffering, he says, I wanted to eat this meal before I suffer. That links it with the language of the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah. So there are some very important theological precedents to the things that Jesus says at the Last Supper. During the supper, Jesus is going to predict that Peter will deny him. In fact, this is one of the prayer passages in Luke, because Jesus is going to say, Peter, I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail. Now, Peter, of course, protests, I won't deny you, Lord. I'm ready to die for you. But Jesus knows more about Peter than Peter knows about Peter. And so they now are going to leave the upper room, and they're going to go across the Kidron Valley to a garden that is called Gethsemane. And Luke tells us that Jesus now is going to begin praying, and he is in such distress in his prayer that his sweat congeals until it was thick like blood. I would suppose this sort of physiological feature of Jesus' distress might have been quite fascinating to Luke, who was a physician. I don't know. But in any case, Jesus is going to pray initially that this cup, if it possible, could it pass from him? Now, the cup is an Old Testament imagery of the wrath of God. You find it in Isaiah, you find it in other of the prophets, where it's used as a symbol of the cup of wine, which is the cup of God's wrath. If that is how we are to understand the cup in Gethsemane, then this means that Jesus is taking upon himself divine wrath that was supposed to be for the whole world, but the nations of the world, but he is going to take that upon himself, and he is going to suffer in their behalf. So the cup seems to be a symbol of his coming death and his suffering. Now, this is the Kidron Valley over which Jesus passes to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. This is on the eastern side of the city. Today, this valley is probably as much as maybe 20 feet higher than it was in the days of Jesus. Over the centuries, there's been enough construction and enough erosion, and the silt has sifted down in the valley that it has raised the level of the valley. So it was much deeper when Jesus would have crossed it 2,000 years ago. But he would have left the city, which is on the upper left, and then he would come across this valley and up this direction, so that somewhere up here there is an olive grove, and Jesus is going to enter that, and that's where he's going to pray. Keep in mind that all of this area is going to be full of camps. There are literally hundreds of encampments of pilgrims who have come to Jerusalem for the Passover. So these are little encampments, usually probably tents, people maybe even sleeping out, certainly cooking on outside fires. So to find Jesus in this maze of encampments, for which there really aren't any streets, they're just kind of a maze, the authorities are going to need an insider. And they're going to find that insider in Judas, who's going to help them locate Jesus. But Jesus is going up then on the Mount of Olives, and there he's going to pray. Now, the arrest and trial of Jesus, which is described in all four Gospels, contains, for the most part, the same basic elements. If you compare Matthew, Mark, and John, you will see that for the most part, they're going to say the same thing. Even though John's Gospel is quite unique for most of its extent, when you get back to the time of the trial of Jesus, John's Gospel is going to merge back into the basic narrative you find in the Synoptics. Luke is going to follow that same pattern. He's going to show Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's going to talk about the betrayal of Judas. He's going to talk about the high priest before whom Jesus is arraigned. He's going to talk about the Sanhedrin, the 3 denials of Peter, and Jesus before Pilate. Luke, on the other hand, is going to have one unique part, and that is he's going to show that Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, who's going to hopefully examine Jesus, and Pilate's hoping that I think Herod would just simply take Jesus off his hands, but as it turns out, Herod is going to send him back. But this is only described in the Gospel of Luke. And then, of course, you have Luke showing Pilate declaring Jesus to be innocent. This would be very important for apologetic purposes, that Jesus was not a threat to the Roman Empire. And then there is the release of Barabbas, which is described by all 4 Gospels. On his way to the hearing before the Sanhedrin, Jesus would probably have walked up this set of steps. These steps were excavated in the late 1800s, but they go back to the very first century. And this is the usual path that you would have taken up onto the western side of the city where the Sanhedrin would convene. So if you ever get a chance to go to Jerusalem and you want to walk where Jesus walked, I would say walking up this set of steps, which are open to the public, is still a pretty good chance you'll be walking just where Jesus walked. Now, the trial of Jesus proceeds in 2 stages, but each with different indictments. There's a Jewish stage and there will be a Roman stage. The Jewish stage, there is a preliminary examination by Annas, which is the high priest emeritus. That is only described in the Gospel of John. But then all of the Gospels describe Jesus before the high priest, whom we know to be Caiaphas. He is condemned by the Sanhedrin. This is going to be true in the narratives of all of the synoptics. And the real indictment before the Sanhedrin is going to be blasphemy. When Jesus says, "Hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of God," as far as the Jewish leadership is concerned, that is blasphemy, and that is worthy of death. However, the Jewish Sanhedrin does not have the authority to execute someone. This is not only mentioned in the New Testament, it is also mentioned in Flavius Josephus. And so if they are going to get an execution, they're going to have to get the Romans to carry it out. So that brings us to sort of the second stage, if you will, of the trial, which is the appeal to Pilate. The first appearance before Pilate is described in all 4 of the Gospels. Luke, of course, as I mentioned, is going to say that Jesus appears briefly before Herod Antipas, who sends him back to Pilate. And then the final appearance before Pilate is in all 4 Gospels. And here, once again, Jesus will be condemned to death. Pilate is not comfortable with this. He does not think Jesus is deserving of death. In fact, he is going to declare Jesus to be innocent. But the pressure is upon him that if he does so, he will be in some way allowing a treasonous teacher to go free. And so finally the indictment is going to be given. But as you can see, this is a different indictment that you find in the Jewish stage. You can't indict Jesus for blasphemy before the Romans, because the Romans themselves are pagans. As far as the Jews are concerned, the Romans are blaspheming God every time they get out of bed in the morning. So that's not going to hold any weight with Pontius Pilate. So the stage of the trial that goes to Pilate, the charge is somewhat adjusted to a charge of stirring up the people, the charge of treason. Now, if Jesus' hearing before the Sanhedrin was a formal trial, there were some serious breaches of procedure. In the Jewish Talmud, it describes how the Sanhedrin was supposed to conduct a trial. They were not supposed to do it at the high priest's home, but in fact, that is where it happens in the Gospels. They were not supposed to do it at night, but that's when it happened in the Gospels. They were not supposed to do it during a festival, but this is in fact on the eve of the Passover. They were not supposed to give a guilty verdict in a single session. They would have to reconvene for a second session in order to give an execution order. But of course, this all happens in one night, in a few hours. So either Jesus' trial was not a formal trial, or else the Sanhedrin acted out of desperation and they just sort of threw their own judicial procedure to the winds. But in any case, they certainly have conducted a very unusual and irregular hearing for the trial of Jesus. When we continue in our final lecture of Luke's gospel, then we will see the outcome of all these things.